What is good, everybody? Welcome back. Subject of today's conversation is racial injustice, racial inequality, and racially unequal effects of the coronavirus, the novel coronavirus, COVID-19. So, as usual, very uplifting content to buoy your mood and set you on a path of beauty and grandeur today. So, this disease that is ravaging our country, our state, and the world is a disease. It's an infectious disease. It's um, transmitted through like spittle, mucus. It sticks on surfaces. It's highly contagious. Um, it, I guess there's some evolving information about the actual character of the virus, the properties of the virus, the ways that it gets transmitted. But the bottom line hasn't changed. This is a highly, highly contagious virus that is pretty much everywhere. Um, and so when you've got a highly contagious virus that's pretty much everywhere, that hangs out, that lurks on surfaces, and if you touch those surfaces and then you touch your face, oh shit, I just touched my face. That's my bad. You touch surfaces and then you touch your face, you can get it, right? If somebody comes along and they touch, yesterday I was out, no, not yesterday, no, 2 days ago I was out playing socially distant soccer with a friend where we couldn't get within like 20 feet of each other, which is, by the way, way harder than having to dribble. But at one point I was so tired that I leaned up against the goalpost, and then I was like, no, I touched metal, because somebody else could have come by an hour before me and leaned against that goalpost after having wiped their nose, and then I lean against the goalpost and then I wipe my nose, and I get sick, right? I mean, that's the way that this thing can be transmitted. All of which is to say that this seems to us like something that is ostensibly, as the governor of New York State, Andrew Cuomo, called it, the quote unquote great equalizer, right? You could be anybody and get this thing. You could be Donald Trump and get this thing touching a golf club at your golf resort. Or you could be a sanitation worker and get this thing touching the back of your truck. Ostensibly, right? And yet we know that that's actually not true. I mean, yes, it is true that anybody can get it. Oh, y'all can get it. But what is not true is that every group, every social group, every racial group, every demographic group is going to experience it in proportion. That is not true. This is a racist disease in the sense that it produces racially unequal outcomes. But I said it's a racist disease, but the disease itself isn't racist. What happens is society is racist. Society is set up in racially unequal ways. And so when a disease comes and interacts with society that is set up in racially unequal ways, the disease is going to have racially unequal outcomes. So that's what we want to talk about today. Boom! Slide number 2. Second slide. So you may have heard this phrase, environmental injustice, or environmental justice is a phrase that you might have heard, or environmental racism. And this is basically the idea that environmental harms and hazards are unequally distributed across racial groups. So let's just, out from the top of my bald head, let's pull an example, a random example of an environmental hazard. Let's say air pollution. Okay? Air pollution, it's in the air. Everybody breathes, even billionaires breathe, so how can air pollution be racist? Well, where are factories that produce air pollution located? Are they located right next to Mar-a-Lago? Are they located on the Upper West Side of New York City? Are they located in, what's a fancy, are they in Evanston? No, they're not. Where are factories located? They're located in poor neighborhoods. They're located in minority neighborhoods. Um, and so air pollution, contamination, and then the resulting respiratory illnesses are disproportionately experienced by communities of color and poor communities of color in particular. The sort of famous case that launched the phrase environmental racism was a case of dumping of municipal waste management processing plants in a community of color in, oh, was it Mississippi, maybe? Anyway, Robert Bullard, the famous sociologist, was the sort of the foreparent of the field of environmental racism. Another example that we often turn to in the literature is the example of Chester, Pennsylvania, which has become or was for many years. I haven't followed the case. I actually think it still is to a large extent. But Chester, Pennsylvania is a sort of a post-industrial urban place, almost 100% African American. And it was a place where waste incineration plants were located, and there were several waste incineration plants located in this one city, Chester, Pennsylvania, that was mostly black. And so the folks, residents of the city, had radically outsized rates of cancer, rates of respiratory illness, and so on and so forth. And so that's what we mean by environmental racism. Okay, the environmental harm, damage from pollution, contamination, and by the way, parsing environment and health, taking these two things apart, is almost not really all that useful, because if there's air pollution, and there's an unequal amount of air pollution in one neighborhood versus another, there's going to be an unequal amount of respiratory illness in one neighborhood versus another, right? And so environment and environmental inequality, environmental racism, and health inequality, health racism, racial disparities in health outcomes, those are two sides of the same coin. So Chester, Pennsylvania, okay? So it's a black city. It's almost exclusively African American. And it's a sick city, and it's a poor city, and it's an exploited city. Is it sick, and is it exploited, and is it facing all of these adverse conditions because it is a black city, right? That is the question. And so if I were to come to you and I were to say, hey, that's environmental racism, you could say to me, well, it is environmentally, racist, I guess, but is it racism in the sense that there is some racist intent? And so what I want to do here is, and actually I think this is the following slide, but to distinguish between two kinds of racism, because when we talk about racism, we often mix up these two kinds of racism, and I think it's important to distinguish between them. But before I get to that, because I know that's on the next slide, let me say a little bit about this idea of like market factors or class dynamics. Now we've learned, because we talked about the phenomenon of the free market, right? So we know what I mean now when I say market factors. That automatically tracks in your little thinking devices. market factors. So what would be a market factor that could explain what looks like environmental racism, but actually isn't? Well, let me play devil's advocate here for a second. So I own a waste incineration company. That's my thing. I burn trash so that we don't have as much trash. And so people from all over the place bring me their trash, and I set it on fire. That's my thing. Well, I have to find a place to do that. And as we've established when we talked about market dynamics, my goal as an entrepreneur, as a business owner, is my profit margin. That's the only thing ethically that I'm supposed to care about, maximizing my profit margin. What's the best way to maximize my profit margin? It's to locate my business in the least expensive place that I can do it, in terms of the cost of the property that I need to inhabit, in terms of the costs of the taxes that I would need to pay, in terms of the wages that I would need to pay, right? And so I want to put my business on the cheapest land, next to the cheapest workers, and the lowest taxes that I can possibly find, okay? And that's not going to be on a golf course. You know what I'm saying? It's going to be in Chester, Pennsylvania. And so it's totally immaterial to me whether the folks that live in Chester, Pennsylvania are white, black, or purple, because that's what, like, people that don't see color always say. I'm devil's advocating here, remember. So it doesn't matter to me, right? I just want to burn trash and make money. The color of the people that work for me, that doesn't make any difference to me. The color of the people that live around me and get sick, that doesn't make any difference to me. I just want it to be the cheapest place I can find. Okay? Well, so that's my market analysis. That's my market dynamics analysis. And so we can make an argument. I'm not sure I'm being fully clear here. Let me try this at a different approach. We can make an argument for something that looks like environmental racism. That has an environmentally unequal outcome, and we can make a market-based explanation for it, which essentially becomes a colorblind argument, and therefore exonerates us, me, the owner of the waste burning place. It exonerates me from any accusation of racism. I can say, I located in Chester not because it was a black city, but because it was an inexpensive city. It was an opportunity. And so in making that market analysis, that market argument, I'm able to exonerate myself, to exempt myself from any accusation of racist intent on my part. But what we need to do is to distinguish between, when we're talking about environmental racism, when we're talking about racial health disparities, we need to distinguish between two different types of racism. And these are, broadly speaking and simply put, the difference between what we might call judicial or legal racism, and the difference between what we might call structural racism or institutional racism or systemic racism or historical racism. I mean, there are lots of different kinds of synonymous phrases that we can use. But judicial racism or legal racism is the kind of racism that most of us think of all the time, right? So if I walk into my class, I'm a student at ISU, and I walk into my class and I look around and I choose where to sit, and I say to myself, in my head, but explicitly in my head, I say, okay, I'm going to sit next to these white people because I like the whites. That's racist, right? That's me being explicitly, clearly, unequivocally racist. Okay. That's judicial racism. When you can trace racism back to explicit racist intent from a single bad actor, that's judicial racism. Why is it called judicial racism? Because it's something that you can prove in court. Okay? So when the National Black Farmers Association sued the United States Department of Agriculture, and they alleged that the United States Department of Agriculture had intentionally denied loan programs and payment programs to black farmers that they had offered to white farmers, and that decision was made for racist purposes, then the National Black Farmers Association was able to prove in court that the United States Department of Agriculture had been racist, and was able to win that case in front of the Supreme Court, and many billions of dollars in settlement. Maybe not many, but $3-ish billions as a settlement. They were able to prove that in court. They were able to demonstrate that there was explicit racist intent on the part of the United States Department of Agriculture. If you can document, if you can find emails or photo or audio recordings or a first-hand witness that can say, yes, the CEO of this or that company said, let's not hire Asians, or let's not hire people from the Middle East, then you can demonstrate judicial racism. But structural racism is stickier, it's squishier, it's a little harder for us to get our heads around, but it's really, really real. And structural racism is, again, let's list off all of these synonyms. Systemic racism, institutional racism, what else did I say? Historical racism. Any of these things are essentially the same idea, and that is, you don't have to have an explicitly racist intent on the part of a single bad actor to have racist outcomes, because we live in a society in which there have been many judicially racist things that have preceded, that have come before, that have set the stage for racial inequality. And so, even though the CEOs of the hospitals and the medical centers, even though the physicians and the nurses, even though the bureaucrats running the testing facilities, none of them wear KKK hoods, right? None of them are white nationalists. They're all good people. But they're all part of a system that reproduces racially unequal outcomes. Yes? Structural racism. So that when an infectious disease like COVID-19 rages through the city of Chicago, it's going to beat up South Shore much more than it's going to beat up the northern Lake Shore, whatever. I don't know my Chicago neighborhoods all that well, but you know what I'm saying. So, as I said before, this is the link to the YouTube clip in which Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, referred to, in the context of announcing that his brother Chris Cuomo, that's kind of a tongue twister to say, who's a news journalist, anchor, something, CNN, something, in the course of announcing that his brother had contracted COVID-19, he made the statement that COVID-19 is quote unquote the great equalizer, right? Because his brother is famous and wealthy and white and young and healthy and has access to all of the things in the world that you would need. And he still got COVID-19. Yeah, he got it, right? He got it, but he survived it. He, you know, recuperated in his basement. He was inconvenienced for 2 weeks, and now he's back to normal. Okay, so is COVID-19 in fact the great equalizer? This is how we started the conversation today. Well, anybody can get it, but you are more likely to get it, and it's more likely to beat your ass if you are a racial minority, if you're in a poor neighborhood, and a number of other demographics as well. We will talk, can't remember if we have talked or will talk about cities versus suburbs versus rural areas and population density and how those things bring to bear. We will also talk, I think we have not talked yet, but we will talk about those things. And we will also talk about jobs, right? Because what kind of job you do has a lot to do with your propensity to get sick and to get hurt by the sickness, right? Because if you're working at a gas station that's open right now, if you're working in a grocery store that's open right now, if you're working construction right now, if you're working in if you're a med tech, you know what I'm saying, in a lab right now, you're more likely to get sick. If you're me and you can work by talking to yourself in front of a computer, you're less likely to get sick. So work matters, the kind of job you do, place matters, the kind of place you live, and race matters. Your color matters a lot for how COVID-19 is going to affect you and your family and your neighborhood. So let's look at some data. This is old data, so it actually looks kind of worse than it is, but it's still pretty fucking bad. This says that Chicago, 30% of residents of Chicago are African American. 70% of COVID-19 deaths, African American. Okay, so you would think if a disease like COVID-19 were not racist, and it hit Chicago. Okay, so COVID-19 is not racist. It doesn't see color. It is colorblind, and it hits Chicago. 30% of people that live in Chicago are black. 30% of people are going to get sick. 30% of African Americans are going to get sick, right? But that's not the case. And we're looking at numbers as of April 6th, and this has changed a little bit, which is why I'm saying this is a little bit weird. This data is not great for it being the end of May right now, but the point is the same. The point hasn't changed. 30% of the population of Chicago is African American, 70% of the deaths. And if you look at all of these states, Illinois, Louisiana, Michigan, North Carolina, you're going to see the same result. If you look at New York City, one of the readings that we did for today talked about New York City. Oddly, black neighborhoods in New York City haven't been the most ravaged by COVID-19, but Latino neighborhoods in New York City have been the most ravaged by COVID-19, as well as Asian neighborhoods, which presumably has something to do with having large immigrant populations. So we look at Chicago more closely. And I don't want to freak any of y'all out because this is Illinois State University. I know most of y'all are Illinoisans, and many of you are probably Cook Countyans or, you know, Chicagoland suburbians, if not from Chicago proper. But we aren't doing that awesomely at COVID in the great state of Illinois. I mean, you know, we're not doing that awesomely. I don't know what else to tell you. I don't fully know exactly why we're not doing that awesomely, but like So we're in the top three. Look, there's 50 states and a bunch of territories. There's a lot of people around, a lot of states. There's 50 of them. I don't know if you remember that from elementary school. I barely do, but I just think there's 50 of them. We haven't like acquisitioned any other states since I was in elementary school. I don't think so. There's 50 of them. So to the best of my recollection, and I'm riffing a little bit here, Illinois is number 3 in terms of the gross number of COVID-19 cases. Number 3. Number 1 is still New York. Number 2 is New Jersey, and number 3 is Illinois. And I'm what is today? I don't fucking know, because every day is the same day. It's May 26th, 2020, right now. Just in case you happen to be watching this at a totally different time, it is, as I speak, May 26th, 2020. And so as I speak, Illinois is number 3 in the gross number of cases, but it's the only one of the top 3 where our curve is not currently declining. So our curve went up very dramatically in April, and then it has subsequently plateaued. But if you look at New York and New Jersey, it went up really high, and then it started going down. And so they are demonstrably on the downslope. Illinois is not on the downslope. Illinois is still flat. We've plateaued, but we haven't started to decrease in terms of the numbers of cases yet. And so you can make an argument, and I think a pretty reasonable argument, that the state of Illinois and the city of Chicago is at present the worst off of the whole dang country in terms of coronavirus right now. Cook County, in terms of counties, if you break it out instead of states, instead of 50 states, if you break it out and look at counties across the country, Cook County has the most cases of any county in the country. As of May 21st, we got more than 1,800 people in Chicago proper who have died from COVID-19 that we know of, and that's almost certainly a substantial undercount. And like the last slide shows, 30% of the population is African American in Chicago, but back April 6th, it was 70% of the deaths. Now it's closer to 50% of the deaths, but that's still super disproportionate in terms of the ratio of the population to the number of people that have died. And so then the question that arises is why? Why is this killing black folks much more in much greater numbers than it's killing white folks? Why is it killing Latinos in much greater numbers than it's killing white people? Why does South Shore, which is a predominantly African-American neighborhood, have the highest death rate of any neighborhood in Chicago? Why do Latinos have the most confirmed cases across the entire state of Illinois? Why? And we haven't even begun, and in this presentation, and I regret this now that I'm thinking about it, and this is an oversight on my part, but we haven't even talked about Native American or Indian American reservations. I recall reading somewhere that if you bracket out the Navajo Nation as its own country, it's above the United States in terms of per capita cases and per capita deaths. So Indian reservations are being ravaged, and I'm kind of riffing here, like I don't have like hard data off the top of my head, but my recollection and the reading that I've done is that Indian reservations are being ravaged at a rate that makes, black neighborhoods in Chicago seem relatively benign. So this is very serious, and it has demonstrably racially unequal outcomes. So let's talk a little bit, puzzle out in real time here a little bit why that might be. Well, William Julius Wilson, tip of the hat to the man um, writes um, all the way back in the mid-90s, this book that we read from, When Work Disappears, that essentially tells a story of, and I'm simplifying a little bit, stylizing a little bit, and paraphrasing a lot, but it's the story of globalization, right, in the 1970s, basically, and neoliberalism, which is the sort of really unfettered markets, right? We talked some days back about markets, market dynamics, and public goods, and so you understand what I mean when I talk about a free market versus a regulated market. And so neoliberalism in the 1980s was really, really free markets, right? No, very, very little government oversight. And at the same time, globalization, right? So financial markets and investment, foreign direct investment, trade in goods, and these sorts of things becoming more and more intertwined, which allowed work to move, to export itself, right? And work was able to export itself. Not all work. Some work is geographically fixed. If I have a gold mine or an oil well, I can't, export it to Bangladesh. The oil's in the ground here. If I have a restaurant, I can't make the food in, Nigeria, and because it's cheaper, and then bring it here. It's not cost effective to do that. So some industries can't be exported, but manufacturing industries, which were the lifeblood of center cities, of inner cities and urban places throughout most of the 20th century, could be exported, right? If I'm making cars, if I'm making shirts, if I'm making paper, whatever it is, I can export that kind of work. And so that work, that whole manufacturing, that blue collar work that you didn't need a college degree to do, but that in 1950 would still pay you enough money to support a family and pay down a mortgage. Those jobs started going overseas. They started going to Mexico. They started going to Central America. They started going to Sub-Saharan Africa. They started going to South Asia. They started going to Southeast Asia. They started going to Central Asia. They went a lot of damn places. But they left us, right? They left the center cities, and the jobs that replaced those, and I think I'm going a little bit too far into Wilson here, but the jobs that replaced those tended to be service sector jobs, retail jobs, restaurants, gas stations, stores, malls, this sort of stuff. And those jobs weren't in the cities. They weren't in the inner city neighborhoods where folks of color were living. And so you have this disappearance of work, and so you have this large scale deterioration of access to work and the quality of work, and so the quality of benefits and the quality of wages and so on and so forth. All of this deterioration has negative effects for black neighborhoods, greater negative effects for black neighborhoods than it does for white neighborhoods. Why? Because we are segregated, right? Because there is such a thing as a black neighborhood and a white neighborhood. If we were all perfectly integrated and living in perfectly mixed neighborhoods, we wouldn't have these problems. They wouldn't hit us unequally as they do. But we are segregated, and we are segregated because we're racist. We're segregated because up until the 1960s, we were literally, judicially, legally, all separated. And because the implications, the ripples of that wave are still rippling out. And so we live in white neighborhoods and black neighborhoods and Latino neighborhoods, and In cities at least, there are ethnic enclaves of other kinds too. There's Latvian neighborhoods and Polish neighborhoods and Middle Eastern neighborhoods and so on and so forth. And when we live separate, then we have different levels of access to resources, right? And so let's look through this list of all the different things that we have different levels of access to, okay? We have different levels. So remember, segregation, let me start with let me just read the damn slide. Should I read the slide? I'll read the damn slide. Segregation is the difference between poor people and poor communities, right? So, and we've talked about this already. This is a review. So you can be a poor white person, but if you are a poor white person, you live in a community that is mixed income. And if you live in a mixed income community, then you have the same access, structural access to resources that the richer people in your community have, right? But if you're a poor black person, you live in a poor community. And so you have structurally less access to those resources than the white person has, even if that white person or that white family has the same income as you, right? That's what we mean by spatial inequality. It's the difference between poor people and poor neighborhoods. I might be a poor white person and have the same income as a poor black person, but by virtue of my skin color, by virtue of the fact that my skin color has determined the neighborhood that I get to live in, I have access to better shit, okay? My schools are better, my public transportation is better, my roads are better, my banks are better, my doctors are better, my hospitals are better, my access to insurance is better. You know what I'm saying? I can get better health insurance. I can get better life insurance. I can get better disability insurance. All these things that I need to feel like I'm looked after, my family is looked after, and then if I'm covered with decent insurance plans of all types, then I might be willing to take a risk and be an entrepreneur and get a loan from the bank and start a business. Of course, I have way better access to credit and way better access to bank loans by virtue of being a white person in a white neighborhood that's a mixed income neighborhood, even if I'm a poor white person, right? So if we look at Chicago, you're going to see that communities of color, neighborhoods of color, whether they're Latino, whether they're African American, are going to have their housing is going to be of lower quality. It's going to be less kept up. It's going to be less safe. It's going to be less healthy, right? It's more likely to be sick buildings. That's a thing. If you've got lead paint on the walls, if you've got copper pipes, older structures that haven't been kept up, that haven't been maintained at code or whatever, are sick. You're more likely to have asbestos. You're more likely to have black mold. You're more likely to have these respiratory issues, right? All of this stuff. And so housing makes a big difference. It really does. Healthcare makes a big difference, right? There are data out there that suggest that black folks have a much harder time getting tested for COVID-19 than white folks. It may be proximity to testing centers. It may be transportation access. I haven't dug into that, but I've seen the data. It's limited, but it does suggest that it's harder for folks of color to get access to the tests. We've talked about food deserts in here, right? A lot of neighborhoods of color are food deserts. They're in places where there isn't easy access to a reliable, affordable source of healthy food, right? Where you're most likely to get your calories that you need from the corner store, and it's going to be snack cakes and soda. Public schools. This is an obvious one. Public schools are funded to a large extent by property taxes. If you live in a rich neighborhood, your house is appraised highly, the value of it is high, the property taxes that you're assessed are going to be high, as are those of your neighbors, which means that school's going to have a lot more money. So it's going to have better paid teachers, it's going to have better buildings, it's going to have better shit. It's going to have more resources for more kinds of innovative learning and technology and so on and so forth. It's going to have smaller classrooms. I mean, all these things make a massive difference when we're talking about setting individuals on a path of upward social mobility, right? If you go K through 12 in classes with 35 other people, or if you go K through 12 in classes with 10 other people, that's going to make a huge difference in the long run. Infrastructure, our social infrastructure, right? Our parks, our bars, our restaurants, our third spaces, our coffee shops, our bowling leagues, so on and so forth, as well as our regular hard infrastructure, our roads, our L stops, our bus stops, all of these things, our sidewalks. If we have shitty, crumbly sidewalks, we're a lot less likely to be outside walking. We're a lot less likely to chop it up with our neighbors. We're a lot less likely to be able to rely on the people around us if we get sick, right? If we have amazing sidewalks that are in great condition and it looks really great and there's like landscaping and all the green and blah, 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 then we're much more likely to be outside walking around. We're much more likely to meet our neighbors, interact with the people around us, and then we're much more likely to be able to call on them in a crisis, right? So our hard infrastructure, our social infrastructure is going to be different for different neighborhoods. And so it's so different races have different access to these things. Political representation, right? If my district has been gerrymandered in such a way that my neighborhood of color is in a district that all the other neighborhoods are like wealthy white neighborhoods, and there's a Republican that represents us, then my neighborhood doesn't have political representation, and there's nobody to advocate for us in the state legislature. Insurance, we've talked about, mental health, right? All of these things. And so when you have spatial inequality, you have thank you for your patience. When you have spatial inequality, you have, that's the building block. That's the one of the main pieces of the foundation of a racist society, of a society that has structures in place, is why we call it structural racism. It has social structures in place that direct one racial group in this way and another racial group in that way, right? And so when those structures are in place and we get broadsided by COVID-19, it is going to flow through those neighborhoods very differently. Okay, so all of this sucks. We're sad and we're pissed, right? We're clutching our bald heads like this. Oh, I'm touching my face a lot. I shouldn't do that. Don't touch your face, people. But so what can we do about this? This feels very big and overwhelming, and I'm angry, but I don't know where to direct that. Well, I would suggest that structural racism is at its core is a political problem. Okay, and so I would suggest that the best solutions are political solutions. And so individual solutions, like if you want to say, I'm going to work for racial justice and I'm going to, become a part of this organization, or I'm going to, protest or something like that, that's good. Or I'm going to boycott this company because they do racist shit, or, I'm not going to let the people in Chester burn my trash, or whatever it is. Those are fine things to do. But what we need to do to address the root of racist social structures is to advocate in the political arena for policy and legislation that mitigates racial inequality. And so specifically with reference to COVID-19, we need to look to public sector financial support for communities of color. And that needs to be predominantly, or at least preeminently, in the form of healthcare, right? So communities of color need access to good, reliable, consistent, and racially just healthcare, right? For folks that have lost their jobs, we ought to be compensating them. And the stimulus money that we have dispersed at the federal level is a little drop in the bucket of what is really needed. So if we look at some of the examples of Western European countries and what they have done differently, what the United States did was we gave everybody a check. If you filed your taxes in 2019, you got a check in April of 2020. It was like $800 per person and $500 per child, basically. Yeah, you can maybe pay rent for a month or two with that. You get some extra groceries, so it's better than nothing. But what folks in what countries, what governments in Western Europe did was they paid companies to not fire their employees. So in other words, rather than give the money to the fired person, they paid the company to continue to pay people, to keep people on their payroll, basically. So what's your payroll? My payroll's 90 grand a month. Okay, here is a 90 grand a month to your company for your payroll, right? And so now everybody is still employed. And that has sort of, how do I say this? It's better for the macroeconomy. It doesn't create these perverse incentives that our stimulus package creates. It keeps people employed. It saves in opportunity costs, because if a restaurant has to shut down and then reopen, it's going to cost them a lot more to shut all the way down and then reopen than it is to just, keep paying people, keep the lights on, keep the rent paid, and then when the lockdown is lifted, everybody just goes back to work. They're still there. They're still on the payroll. They've still been getting paid, getting their health insurance and their retirement plan and so on and so forth. It makes a whole lot more sense. So programs like that, big public sort of expanding the safety net, but with particular focus on healthcare and employment, these are the things that we need right now to address the racially unequal outcomes of COVID-19. That's all I got. Tip of the hat to all of the people, and something. Send me an email if you have any questions. Bye.